Order, welcome into part 2 of Good News, and today the topic is what's the deal with sin? And I don't know about you, but that little 3-letter word has the potential to trigger all sorts of responses in people because it's been so badly used, to be honest. And for many people, when they hear that term, they hear a story of a God who created the world and then made a list of naughty things and told us not to do them, and then we do them anyway. And that makes us sinners, and God's very disappointed in that. And God has to punish us for that, but ultimately decides to come and sort of experience that punishment himself in the Jesus story on our behalf, so that then he can find his way to forgive us. This is one version of what's sometimes called the good news. It doesn't sound that good to me. And in fact, doesn't really mirror much of what Jesus seems to be talking about when he's wandering around. And so I want to offer a different way of thinking about that today, that doesn't see sin as things on a naughty list that we shouldn't do but we sort of want to do or end up doing anyway, that makes us sort of inherently depraved and deserving of punishment. Instead, I want to think about what it is the language is trying to get at in the human condition, in the reality of our real experience, and then what it is that the biblical story and the story of the gospel does to help us find ways of living that are freer and more flourishing and more liberating and more whole. And so one of the things that we're seeing happen in the biblical story all the way through are these kind of shifting, evolving, and sometimes contrasting perspectives on how we understand both sort of what it means to be human and how we should live in the world, and also what God is like, and what we do about all of that. And so the biblical story is wrestling with, in terms of a human experience, this dual reality of this profound idea that human beings are capable of uniquely beautiful acts of love and self-giving and compassion and empathy and inclusion, self-sacrifice. Human beings, creativity, like human beings are capable of so much extraordinary good in the world. And yet at the same time, human beings are uniquely capable, at least in the ecosystem that we inhabit and of the creatures that we know of, human beings are uniquely capable of harm, of sometimes some quite monstrous things to others, to ourselves, and to our environment. And the language of sin, best understood, is trying to get at that dark side. It's trying to name that part of us that acts and behaves and exists in ways that are harmful and destructive to relationships, to one another, and to our ecological environment, and to ourselves. And what we discover is that the kind of harmful ways of being in the world always operate at both the personal and the structural level. So they tend to move from personal to systemic. So you think about the story in Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and they're these very personal stories of struggle. And then we move forward to the story of Egypt and a nation that's built on racism and slavery and so on. And you see that kind of very personal struggle has now become embedded within entire systems and structures that are oppressive and cause vast amounts of suffering. And we continue to see the same thing now. We might have an argument with our neighbour over where the fence should be, and get into a bit of a, animated conversation about that. And then we do that as countries, and we end up blowing each other up, right? So we move from the personal to the large scale, and we see the same issues kind of playing out in both spaces, just with more or less on the line. And often the systems and structures that we see, they become greater than the sum of their parts. They become these overwhelming systems that suck people into their vortex and push suffering people to the margins and make it nearly impossible to imagine any other kind of reality. So what's the kind of response to this then in the scriptures? Well, the first main response is the idea of law. What we need in order to manage this darker side of the human condition is to outlaw all the stuff we think is wrong, and that will give us a way to control our behavior. And that makes sense to some degree, and it works to some degree. It helps keep things under control to a certain extent. And whether that's the religious laws of ancient Israel or the modern contemporary laws of our society, that's one of the things we do to kind of manage our communal lives together. But by the time we get to the Jesus story in particular in the Bible, we've got religious people in particular who are very, very passionate about the rules, about the law, and they take it upon themselves to make sure everybody is behaving as they should be. And if you're not, then you're sort of categorized as a sinner. You're pushed to the edge. But if you can be one of the good ones, one of the pure ones, you kind of get to be in. And so sin is kind of breaking the rules, and they're running around trying to make sure who's breaking the rules and who's not breaking the rules, and so on. And Jesus' kind of prophetic challenge to these people is that by reducing sin down and sort of stripping of its depth of meaning in terms of harm and destroying of relationships and so on, and turning it into this kind of rule-based purity code, they had actually become in themselves participators in very, very harmful, we might even say sinful, structures and ways of being in a religious sense. So their demands for religious purity and avoidance of sin had themselves become this very dehumanizing, oppressive, stifling obsession that they had. And so one of the things that Jesus most commonly names as the most harmful thing that people around him are doing is excluding people for thinking they were sinners, right? So ironically, sort of the sin that seems to get Jesus really going is excluding people because we've called them sinners. So what's a more helpful way to think about this then? If sort of the law-based approach doesn't take us far enough, or it doesn't get us where we need to go in terms of an invitation to a flourishing, transformed kind of life. Well, I think this language of harm is a helpful one, and we see it actually in Paul's letter to the church in Rome. He says, love does no harm to a neighbour, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. In fact, he says all of the law can be summed up in this idea, love your neighbour as you love yourself. And so for Paul in this passage, those two sides of the human condition, if you like, are characterized as love and as harm. And I think harm is a really helpful way of thinking about what it is the biblical authors are often trying to do when they use the language of sin. And harm that we do to one another, to ourselves, to creation, at its natural end game ends up in places of violence and even at its worst, ultimately, death. So what the language of sin in the Bible is trying to do is to name the ways in which we participate in harmful ways of being, either cultivating hatred in our hearts and then acting on that in violent ways. That it's trying to name that side of us that we all kind of negotiate and have to wrestle with. And what we're seeking when we engage in the story of Christ are resources to help us cultivate life and flourishing and love and empathy and compassion, and also kind of heal the parts of us that are tempted toward harmful ways of being in the world. Now, even when we use this kind of language, the temptation is to immediately think about those on the other side as being the ones who are the most harmful. So we tend to split ourselves up. As much as we split ourselves up kind of internally, we also split ourselves up with one another. And so we become the goodies and they're the baddies. That's the kind of story we tell ourselves. Cops versus robbers, heroes versus villains, cowboys versus Indians, Christians versus Muslims, West versus the East. On and on and on the list goes of ways in which we try and put ourselves on the right side of things. And this is another thing that Paul deals with in his letter to the church in Rome, actually. He's got these two factions in the church that are fighting with each other about who's more important, about who should have control, and they both see the other side as the problem. And so he says this phrase, which perhaps is one of the most badly used phrases in the Bible, although there's a few. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Now, the point of Paul using this phrase is not to tell a 5-year-old, for example, at Sunday school, that they're a sinner and God can't be near them unless they pray the sinner's prayer and repent. That's actually a harmful practice, because we teach children to internalize a deep sense of brokenness and shame and sinfulness, and that God is kind of disappointed in them. No. The point of all have sinned is supposed to be that for any of us who are tempted to blame those people over there on the other side for all the harm and violence in the world, we also need to look at ourselves and the systems we participate in. And this is especially true in the biblical tradition, when it confronts people with power who cause suffering to others. And so, wherever you are in the story, you don't find a prophet. When the prophets come along, you don't find them coming along to a bunch of children in a field or a bunch of slaves suffering under the weight of oppression and say, oh, you're all a bunch of sinners and you need to repent. Instead, you find the prophet standing in front of the king saying, no, this needs to stop. So Jesus comes in the line of these kinds of prophets, and he's calling out those with power who use their power to commit harm and violence on others. And so what Paul's saying is, yes, it's important that we keep doing that, and it's important that we keep looking at the ways we are tempted ourselves, and we do ourselves participate in causing harm and harmful ways of being, especially if we are people with power and privilege who are tempted often to blame those people over there for the problems we see in the world. And so the language of sin is trying to grapple with the harm that we participate in the world, trying to name it, especially when it's used by those with power and privilege, and to help us then find how God, in the story of Christ, meets us in this story and helps to transform us. So in the next session, we're going to talk more about how Jesus saves us from the side of ourselves, if you like. But let me finish with 4 things to say. Firstly, the point of the language of sin is not to convince you that you're a depraved, terrible person that God is disappointed in or disgusted by. Instead, it's supposed to help us see that harm and violence, ego and power, these are not pathways to life. These are not pathways to flourishing. There is a better way, and it's shaped by love. And so if the word sin is maybe too damaged for you, if it's too triggering, then try using harm instead, or maybe dehumanisation, a couple of words that can work instead of something like sin, if that's a trigger point for you. Secondly, the point of the language, as I've said, of all have sinned, is not to terrify children. It's not to make suffering or vulnerable people feel even worse in the midst of their pain. It is a way to stop those with power in particular from blaming others all of the time instead of taking responsibility for the real harm that we're doing. It's to challenge us to examine ourselves rather than just scapegoat another. The third thing, just making rules and laws to try and stop the harm and violence that we do to each other is not a fully transformational strategy. It can kind of manage the worst extremes of the problem. But one of the big insights of the New Testament texts is that we are met in this place and experience something of the divine spirit to transform and reorient our hearts and our minds and our lives and our relationships towards the good and the beautiful and the true and the flourishing. And so in light of this then, the last thing to say is that the idea of salvation then is a really big concept. It includes the liberation of human beings from our tendency to harm and dehumanize one another and ourselves. It's, there are loads of biblical images that are used here. Reuniting, union with God. It's freedom, ransom, redemption, exodus from slavery. It's deliverance from oppression. It's the coming kingdom. It's reconciliation. It's flourishing. It's grace. It's love. It's the discovery, if you like, of what's central to our humanness, which is goodness, love, truth, beauty, compassion, kindness. And so our invitation is to continue to listen to the prophetic claim that to be human is a beautiful thing, to receive a radical kind of grace and allow it to transform our sense of who we are and to transform the way that we live in the world, to experience a kind of rehumanization, a flourishing, a love. So, in session 3, we're going to talk more about how Jesus enters the story and what Jesus does with all of this and how the followers of Jesus interpret it and make sense of it and experience it. So, we'll see you next week.